and much more. These were battles fought in Congress and in the courts, in states and on the frontier, in churches and in schools, in clubs and at the ballot box. They were largely wars of words, occasionally wars of arms, tragically so in the Civil War. The battles included many familiar foes: Republicans and Federalists, the North and the South, Native Americans and new immigrants. They also included a host of newly established political and ideological groups: the Know Nothing Party, the American Protective Association, the National Liberal League, the American Secular Union, the Ku Klux Klan, and scores, if not hundreds more, of such newly minted political and ideological groups. Let me just focus on one running episode in this great 19th century battle, namely the repeated clashes between Protestants and Catholics over the meaning of separationism. The long and the sad story of the anti-Catholicism of 19th century American Protestants and Catholics, American Protestants is well known. Around 1800 or so, American Protestants, Catholics had seemed ready to put their bitter and their bloody battles behind them. But with the swelling tide of Catholic emigres into America after the 1820s, all demanding work and building schools and establishing charities and converting souls and gaining influence, native-born Protestants and patriots began to protest. Catholic bashing became a favorite sport again of preachers and pamphleteers. Then rioting and church burnings broke out in the 1830s and 40s, followed by even more vicious verbal pillorying and repressive actions against Catholics. What several recent studies have made clear is that the principle of separation of church and state became one of the strong new weapons in the anti-Catholic arsenal. Foreign Catholics were for the union of church and state, the propagandists claimed. American Protestants were for the separation of church and state. To be a Catholic was to oppose separationism and American-style liberties. To be a Protestant was to defend separationism and American-style liberties. To bash a Catholic was thus not a manifestation of religious bigotry, but a demonstration of American patriotism. Protestants and patriots began to run closely together, often tripping over each other, to defend separationism and to decry and deny Catholics for their failure so to do. All this is a proper corrective that students of American religious liberty need to hear. But it's important that the newly corrected story not now be read, as it's coming to be read, as a simple dialectic of Protestant separationist hawks versus Catholic unionist doves. And it's important to be clear that the Protestant-Catholic battles over separation of church and state had two sides, with Catholics giving as well as taking, winning as well as losing. And these caveats bear a bit of emphasis. Let me focus on 3 points of emphasis. First, it's important to remember that many American Catholic clergy prior to the 1850s were themselves separationists, building their views in part on ancient patristic and medieval models of 2 communities, 2 cities, 2 powers, 2 swords. These American Catholic clergy saw separation of church and state as an essential principle of religious liberty, especially for a religious minority like themselves, and embraced the doctrine without evident concern. Both Alexis de Tocqueville and Lord Acton commented on this at length, noting especially the disparity between European and American Catholic leaders on this point. Second, it must be remembered that many Protestant anti-Catholic writings started not so much as gratuitous attacks upon American Catholics as counterattacks to several blistering papal condemnations of Protestantism, democracy, religious liberty, and separation of church and state. The papacy, charred by the savagery and the iconoclasm of the French Revolution, had a quite different view of separation of church and state than many American Catholics. In the 1832 papal document Morari Vos, for example, Pope Gregory XVI condemned in no uncertain terms all churches that deviated from the Church of Rome, and all states that granted liberty of conscience, free exercise, and free speech rights to their non-Catholic citizens. For the Pope, it was, quote, an absurd and erroneous proposition to claim that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone. The Pope denounced what he called freedom to publish any writings whatsoever and disseminate them to the people. The Church has always taken action to destroy the plague of bad books. The Pope declared anathema against, quote, the detestable insolence and probity of Luther and other Protestant sons of the devil, those sores and disgraces of the human race who joyfully deem themselves free of all. Even worse, the Pope argued, were the plans of, quote, those who desire to separate the church from the state and to break the mutual concord between temporal authority and the priesthood. The reality, the Pope insisted, was that state officials, quote, received their authority not only for the government of the world, but especially for the defense of the true Catholic Church. In the blistering syllabus of errors of 1864, the papacy condemned as cardinal errors the proposition that, quote, Protestantism is nothing more than another form of the same true Christian religion alongside Catholicism. It's likewise a cardinal error that, quote, the church ought to be separate from the state and the state from the church. And then 6 years later, the Vatican Council of 1870 declared the Pope's teachings to be infallible and condemned anew Protestants as, quote, heretics who dared subordinate the divine magisterium of the church to the judgments of each individual's conscience. It is perhaps no surprise that American Protestants repaid such alarming comments in kind, and then with compounding interest. The Pope, as Americans heard him, had condemned the very existence of Protestantism and the very fundamentals of American democracy and liberty. Many Protestants saw in the papacy's favorable references to its past medieval powers specters of the church's tyrannical rule in a unified Christendom. This simply could not be for Protestants. Conveniently armed with brand new editions of the writings of Martin Luther and John Calvin, American Protestants repeated much of the vitriolic and ugly anti-Catholic and anti-clerical rhetoric that had clattered so loudly throughout the 16th century Protestant Reformation. At least initially, the loud commendation of America's separation of church and state and loud condemnation of the Catholic union of church and state was more of a rhetorical quid pro quo to the papacy than a political low blow to American Catholics. But inevitably, there was plenty of cheap shots taken and plenty of political imitation, and especially in the hands of the propagandists. The rhetoric brought anti-Catholicism and pro-separationism in close association in the pamphlets and in the writings, especially of the fringe groups on the right and on the left. A third and a final caveat about this Catholic-Protestant separation of church and state story is to remember that when local anti-Catholic measures did pass, and they did far too often in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, both the United States Supreme Court and sometimes the U.S. Congress sometimes provided Catholics with relief, often using the very principle of separation of church and state to afford that relief. Thus, for example, in an 1866 case of Cummings versus Missouri, The court held that a state may not deprive a Catholic priest of the right to preach for failure to take a mandatory oath disavowing his support for Confederate states. Separation of church and state exists for the sake of protecting liberty of conscience, especially that of a priest, and he cannot be forced to take an oath. In Watson versus Jones in 1871 and 3 progeny cases, the court required civil tribunals to defer to the judgment of the highest religious authorities in resolving intra-church disputes that came to the courts, and explicitly extended that principle to Catholics, whose highest authority, of course, sat in the Vatican. In Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States in 1892, the court refused to uphold a federal law forbidding contracts with foreign clergy, a vital issue for the Catholic magisterium. In Bradford versus Roberts in 1899, the court upheld against Establishment Clause challenge a federal grant to build a Catholic hospital in the District of Columbia. In Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, the court invalidated a state law making public school attendance mandatory, thereby protecting the rights of Catholic parents and schools to educate children in a Catholic religious school environment. These and several other Supreme Court holdings were in part expressions of the principle of separation of church and state. And there were many more such Catholic victories in state courts, in cases where separation was again used as a means to protect religious consciences, clergy, and corporations from governmental interference. All this changed rather dramatically with the Supreme Court case of Everson versus Board of Education in 1947. This case made 2 major moves at once. First, the court applied the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the states. Congress shall make no law now became in effect government of any sort, federal, state, and local, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And second, Justice Black read into the Establishment Clause a strict separationist logic that was amply coated and coded with some of the anti-religious and anti-clerical sentiments that Black had absorbed as a former ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan. The Establishment Clause means at least this, Justice Black wrote for the Everson Court. Neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious institutions or activities, whatever they may be called. Neither a state nor the federal government can openly or secretly participate whatsoever in the affairs of any religious organization or groups, or vice versa. In the words of Jefferson, the clause of establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. In the next 3 cases, Justice Black began to reveal some of his stronger anti-religious sentiments. In the 1948 case, McCullum versus Board of Education, Justice Black, speaking for the majority, wrote, "Religion is simply too powerful, too sinister, too greedy to allow its unhindered pervasion or perversion of the civil government. The same powerful religious propagandists who are allowed to succeed in making one inroad on the state and its laws doubtless will continue their propaganda looking toward complete domination and supremacy of their particular brand of religion. It is nearly always by insidious approaches that the citadels of liberty are most successfully attacked. The First Amendment has thus erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach." The Supreme Court applied its strict separationist logic in these early years primarily in cases challenging the traditional state patronage of religious education. In more than 24 cases after Everson, the court purged religion from the public school and largely removed religious schools from state support. In the 1971 case Lemon versus Kurtzman, the court distilled the strict separationist logic of these early education cases into a general logic to be applied in all future Establishment Clause cases in education or any other area of life. Henceforth, every law challenged under the Establishment Clause, whether federal, state, or local, would pass constitutional muster only if 3 criteria were satisfied. First, the law in question had a secular purpose. Second, the law in question had a primary effect that neither advanced nor inhibited religion. And third, the law in question fostered no excessive entanglement between church and state officials. This Lemon test, as it was called for the Lemon v. Kurtzman case, rendered the Establishment Clause a formidable obstacle to many traditional forms and forums of church-state cooperation and government patronage and participation in religion. Particularly the lower courts used this Lemon test to outlaw all manner of government subsidies for religious charities and social services and mission works, government use of religious services, facilities, publications, and much more. A good number of these Establishment Clause cases, in the name of separation of church and state, helped to extend the ambit of religious liberty, particularly for minority faiths who had no legislative recourse. But some of these cases also began to erode the province of religious liberty by effectively empowering a single secular party to veto popular laws touching religion that caused him or her only the most tangential constitutional injury. It must be remembered that separation of church and state is only one principle that the Establishment Clause teaches, and that the Establishment Clause is only one guarantee that the First Amendment embraces for the protection of religious liberty, the other being the Free Exercise Clause. The First Amendment religion clauses read together say, Congress, now government, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These twin religion clauses hold complementary guarantees of religious freedom. The Free Exercise Clause outlaws government proscriptions of religion, actions that unduly burden the conscience, that restrict religious expression, that discriminate against religion, or that invade the autonomy of churches and other religious bodies. The Establishment Clause, in turn, outlaws government prescriptions of religion, actions that coerce the conscience, that mandate forms of religious expression, that discriminate in favor of religion, or improperly ally the state with churches or other religious bodies. No undue burden on, no coercion of conscience, no undue restrictions on, no undue mandating of religious expression, no discrimination against, no discrimination for religion, no government intrusions within, no government alliances with religious bodies. Read together this way, the Free Exercise and Establishment Clauses afford reciprocal and complementary protections to principles like liberty of conscience, freedom of religious expression, religious equality of a plurality of faiths, and yes, separation of church and state. When viewed in isolation, the principle of separation of church and state serves religious liberty best when it is used prudentially and not categorically. James Madison, a firm proponent of separationism in his later life, warned already in 1833 that, quote, "It may not be easy in every possible case to trace the line of separation between the rights of religion and the civil authority, with such distinctness as to avoid collisions and doubts on unessential points. Madison's caveat has become even more salient today. For better or for worse, the modern American welfare state, and now the modern American security state as well, reaches very deeply into virtually all aspects of modern life through its vast network of education, charity, welfare, childcare, healthcare, instruction, zoning, taxation, immigration, and sundry other laws and regulations. Madison's stated solution was what he called an entire abstinence of the government from interference with religion in any way whatsoever, beyond the necessity of preserving public order and protecting each sect against trespasses on its legal rights by others. This traditional understanding of a minimal state role in the life of society in general and of religious bodies in particular, however alluring it might be in classic libertarian theory, is no longer realistic in practice. Some level of confrontation and cooperation between church and state are almost inevitable in our contemporary polity. It's thus even more important today than it was in Madison's day that the principle of separation of church and state not be pressed to reach what Madison called the unessentials. Government must strike a balance between coercion and freedom. The state cannot coerce citizens to participate in religious ceremonies and subsidies that they find objectionable or odious. But the state cannot prevent citizens from participation in public programs and forums just because these citizens happen to be religious. It is one thing to outlaw Christian prayers and broadcasted Bible readings from the public school. After all, students are compelled to be there, and they're young and impressionable. It's quite another thing to ban moments of silence and private religious speech in these same public schools. It is one thing to bar direct tax support for religious education. Quite another thing to bar tax deductions for parents who choose to educate their children in religious schools. It is one thing to prevent government officials from delegating their core police powers to religious bodies. Quite another thing to prevent them from facilitating the charitable services of voluntary religious and non-religious associations alike. To press separationist logic too deeply into the unessentials not only trivializes religion, as Stephen Carter has effectively argued, it also trivializes the Constitution, converting it from a coda of cardinal principles of national law into a codex of petty precepts for local life. Individuals should exercise a comparable prudence in seeking protection from the public expressions of religion that they cannot abide. In the constitutional schemes of 19th century America, it was not so much the courts as the frontier that provided this freedom. A place away from it all, where one could escape with one's conscience and co-religionists. Today, the frontier still provides this freedom, if not physically in small towns and in wild mountains, then virtually in our ability to sift out and to shut out the public voices of religion that we do not wish to hear. Both modern technology and modern privacy doctrine make escape to this virtual frontier considerably easier than in the days of covered wagons and mule trains. Just turn off Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. Turn away the missionary at your door. Close your eyes to the city crucifix that offends. Cover your ears to the public prayer that you can't abide. Forgo the military chaplain's pastoral counseling. Skip the legislative chaplain's prayers. Walk by the town hall's menorah and star. Don't join the religious student group. Don't vote for the collared candidate. Don't browse the evangelicals' newspapers. Avoid the services of the Catholic counselors. Shun the readings of the Scientologists. Turn down the trinkets of the colporteurs. Turn back the ministries of the hate mongers. All these escapes to the virtual frontier the law does and will protect with force if necessary. Such voluntary self-protections from religion will ultimately provide far greater religious freedom for all than pressing yet another tried and tired federal constitutional case. Thank you for your kind attention.
This regards the argument, the ongoing argument since Roe v. Wade or perhaps prior to Roe v. Wade concerning abortion and one of the other and some of the other related issues. Specifically, one of the an opinion or an argument that I've heard in opposition to attempts to place restrictions on abortion is that anybody who's trying to do that is de facto trying to impose a religious belief upon people who may not share that belief. But I guess to me this brings in mind the larger question of the extent to which our political involvement and or how we vote, the positions that we take on any number of issues may or may not derive directly from our religious convictions or the philosophy that we may derive from our religious convictions. And I guess I was curious how you might analyze that type of argument.
Issues about life, about liberty, about when liberty and life are juxtaposed and which has to be chosen are clearly deep theological issues, and religious communities can, and in my view should, weigh in on those questions. But they're not just theological issues, they're not just religious issues. They are, once raised to constitutional level, first and foremost legal issues, constitutional issues that need to be resolved on legal and constitutional terms. There is nothing wrong, to my mind, of a public square amply populated by diverse religious voices, pro and anti-abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment or whatever the hard cultural issue is at hand. There's nothing wrong in allowing those religious voices with overt religious premises to participate in the debate. They have as much freedom of expression rights as everybody else. And the notion that they have to be foreclosed by reason of some reading of separation of church and state, to my mind, is both ahistorical and fundamentally anti-democratic. I think the burden on religious communities that participate actively in these political debates about these searing issues that have multiple dimensions, including political and constitutional ones, is to be able to articulate arguments independent of but consistent with their theological premises that can reach across to the other religious or the non-religious or the anti-religious and convince him or her that that position is nonetheless a palatable one. And arguments from human dignity, arguments from sacrality of life, arguments about higher primate orders and what that entails, arguments of self-preservation and survival, arguments of liberty of the unspoken and the unrepresented and the like are the kinds of arguments that I think ultimately have to carry. And those are the ones that will be allowed to be constitutional. Those can consist of a series of predicates that are theologically deeply informed. They can be from the heart of those that have those theological convictions and will fight for them to the death, but I think they have to be translated into terms that can be constitutionally palatable.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing your opinion on some of the recent symbolic debates in separating church and state, like God and the Pledge of Allegiance, or displaying the Constitution or the Ten Commandments. Particularly, is that debate important? Those are highly symbolic, rhetorical debates that don't have tangible impacts directly on our lives, whereas there are a lot of other issues that might have tangible impacts. In the scheme of things, is that important? Is that worth spending as much time on it as we do?
Yeah. My own personal view is that a lot of these are silly cases. but nonetheless they're important symbolic cases, and symbols are critical. And the real worry that a lawyer always has, especially a constitutional lawyer, is every little step toward an establishment of religion has to be vigilantly guarded against. And those that don't share my perspective of these being silly cases, but see these as the first beachheads of those that would want to inject God and then Christ and then the triune God into public discourse, into pledges of allegiance, or who want first to put up a Decalogue and then the book of Job and then the Beatitudes. For those that are worried about that parade of horribles ensuing in their mind, I think are properly vigilant in seeking Establishment Clause protection. The Supreme Court has always spent a lot of time on symbolism, not only under the religion clauses, but also in freedom of speech issues about the flag and other important words of that sort. I think the cases themselves betray a Supreme Court very confused about what its Establishment Clause jurisprudence is. You had in the last term, two cases that came down. McCreary County versus the ACLU and Van Orden versus Perry. In the McCreary County case, the Supreme Court said that 2 counties in Kentucky's display of a Decalogue alongside 8 other historical documents was unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause. In Van Orden versus Perry, the Supreme Court said, same day, 2 hours later, a 40-year-old display of a large granite Decalogue on the state capitol grounds in Austin, Texas, alongside 38 other historical documents and monuments, is constitutional under the Establishment Clause. The logic driving the first case, the McCreary County case, was the requirement of secularity, a secular purpose informing the legislation which the court couldn't find. The logic driving the second case, Van Orden versus Perry, was kind of an historical logic and almost a reflexive, this is not an important case logic. And who is this curmudgeon 40 years after the fact coming along complaining about something that happens to be objectionable to him? And the court shows in a plurality of opinions in both cases at least 8 approaches to the Establishment Clause which are currently under consideration by the court, virtually all of which have captured a majority in prior cases at least once, sometimes 2 or 3 times. But the court does not have a consistent logic that it's using under the Establishment Clause. And the consequence of it is these cases look silly in operation. One final point. We have the luxury in this country of fighting these kind of constitutional battles, fine-tuning a constitutional engine, which many countries in the world, especially outside the West, do not have. These issues of religious symbolism, about which we fight in cases that give rise to interesting plurality opinions, give rise to civil wars and bloodshed in many parts of the world. And so we need to enjoy the luxury of being able to fine-tune our Establishment Clause and to invite litigants from all perspectives to the table to participate. It doesn't mean everybody wins all the time, but we do have that